Let's leave Sigmund Freud behind, the psychoanalytic perspective, and move on to another way, another approach to understanding human personality and behavior. This theoretical approach is the humanistic approach. And there are two names of psychologists that you really need to know in the context of humanistic psychology. The first is Abraham Maslow, and the second is Carl Rogers. So this is the basis of humanistic psychology. Here, the emphasis is on the potential of humans for growth, creativity, and spontaneity. And the idea is that unless there's something that goes wrong, we are all motivated to be self-actualizing, to be the best that we can be. Obviously, this is a very positive approach to human personality and one that differs significantly from the viewpoint of Sigmund Freud. We'll begin with Abraham Maslow, the first of the two humanistic psychologists that I want you to know. And I'm not a humanistic psychologist, but I just think Abraham Maslow was wonderful. He's one of my favorite psychologists in the history of psychology. We'll see what you think of him. One of Maslow's contributions to the field was the hierarchy of needs. In his early career, he worked with monkeys, which I did too, so maybe that's a point of comparison. And as a function of his observations of these animals and humans, he developed an idea that we behave in predictable ways based upon our needs, and that those needs can be viewed as hierarchical. So looking at this hierarchy of needs, the lowest level needs are the biological needs, physiological, and above that, safety. The next highest level of needs would be the psychological needs, belongingness and esteem. And the highest level needs are the meta needs. So let's start at the bottom of the pyramid, the lowest level needs. These are physiological needs, and according to Maslow, and this should make sense, we're not going to be interested in higher level needs, feeling like we belong to a group or decorating our homes, unless our physiological needs are met. These are needs for food, water, warmth, air. Then, if those needs are met, we become concerned about safety needs. We are not going to be interested in higher level needs unless our safety needs are met, that we need to feel that our lives are not in danger. And according to Maslow, one piece of evidence for this, or one illustration of it, is that when circumstances permit, we like to have a little bit of extra money in the bank as a way of just having a safety net. Not possible for everyone, but it is pleasurable when we can do that. So above the biological needs, we have the psychological needs. These include belongingness and esteem. So the lower of those two, belongingness, involves a need to feel as if you're part of a group. And then if that need is met, then you become concerned about esteem needs, being able to view yourself positively, being able to feel that other people view you positively. And then, according to Maslow, presuming those lower level needs are met, you then become concerned with the highest level needs, the meta needs, justice, beauty, truth, a need for social justice, a need to have a beautiful environment to decorate your home, a need, for instance, as a scientist to pursue the truth. Those are the highest level needs, and according to Maslow, we're not going to be concerned about those things unless our lower level needs are met. Now, Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been criticized, and I think justifiably. One criticism involves the idea that there are some people who engage in altruistic acts, who, even though they themselves do not have enough food, or they themselves have their lives in danger, they are interested in pursuing social justice, or beauty, or truth. When I think about this, I think about the Tibetan monks who, for altruistic reasons, would commit suicide by fire as a form of social protest. And I'm sure you can think of other examples of altruism that you've seen on the news or learned about through studying history. If you look at the screen, you'll also see a vocabulary term, GHB notebook. And this is information that's not presented in your textbook, but I want you to know it. It has to do with Maslow's approach to gathering data and formulating his theories. Abraham Maslow believed that if our lower level needs are met, then we would be self actualizing. And he wanted to investigate the characteristics of self actualizing people. To do this, he kept a GHB notebook. GHB here represents good human being. So he kept for many years a GHB, good human being notebook, in which he jotted down the names of people that he encountered that he thought could be self actualizing. Now, he was teaching at Brooklyn College, so he would assess his acquaintances, his colleagues, his students, always searching for people that he thought could be self actualizing. And when he found a prospect, he would approach them and ask if he could administer some psychological tests and interview them because he really wanted to find out more about the characteristics of people who were self actualizing. If you read a biography of Abraham Maslow, you'll really enjoy it. But one thing that is interesting is that in the back of quite a few of his biographies, you'll find excerpts from his GHB notebook saying things like, so and so seems like a good prospect for self actualizing material. And then he would say, nope, nope, absolutely not. This is a smug person, definitely not self actualizing. And in fact, Maslow had difficulty finding many people that he ultimately could judge to be self actualizing. And so he decided to try a different approach. What he did was look at historical figures like George Washington Carver, Eleanor Roosevelt, people that seemed to be living up to their human potential, seemed to have done so. And he studied their characteristics. And as a result of all this, he did come up with some characteristics of people he thought to be self-actualizing. He thought that self-actualizing individuals tended to have very few friends but many acquaintances. They really only have very close bonds to a few people. He thought that self-actualizing individuals tended to live in the moment and have kind of a lust for life. Regardless of what they were doing, whether it was mopping a floor or cooking or doing work, they tended to be right in the moment and enjoying themselves. He thought that self-actualizing people had more so-called peak experiences than other people. These peak experiences, P-E-A-K, peak, are basically moments of intense joy and ecstasy. And they tend to come out of the blue without any kind of predictability. And he thought that most of us will experience these at some point in our lives, but that people who are self-actualizing will experience them more often. So you may expect to have a peak experience on some milestone day of your life, like a wedding or a graduation ceremony, but it's not guaranteed. Instead, these peak experiences may occur at those times, but they also occur just any moment of the day, out of the blue, and not dependent on any particular thing that you're doing. Now, Abraham Maslow's work has been criticized, and I think justifiably. Think about his work with the GHB notebook and trying to identify people who are self-actualizing. Maslow presented more of these characteristics if you want to look them up, but the criticism involves how he went about conducting this research. If you think about it, he had to know the characteristics of self-actualizing people in order to be able to identify them. But then he was studying those people in order to find out the characteristics of self-actualizing people. So that's circular reasoning. It's based on circular reasoning, and we all know that's a serious error of logic. He had to know the characteristics of self-actualizing people to be able to study them, identify them. but yet he was using those people to learn the characteristics of self-actualizing individuals. Maslow was well aware of this criticism, and it concerned him to some extent, but he decided that his research was so important that he continued conducting it anyway. Now, there's some other interesting things about Abraham Maslow, and I do encourage you to read his biography. When he was growing up, he grew up in Brooklyn, and his relationship with his mother was just terrible. She sounds like an awful, awful woman. For instance, when he was very young, his prized possession were his records, his 45 records. And one day his mother came into the room and they were on the floor, and she picked them all up and broke them because she didn't like them scattered on the floor. Worse, in my view, she actually killed a kitten that Abraham Maslow had as a boy. And to me, that just puts you on my bad list. I think you're a terrible person. And so, at any rate, he had a childhood like that. And he, in fact, was so angry at his mother throughout his life, he didn't even go to her funeral. But if you look at someone who was raised this way, someone who believes strongly that there's good in people and that people can live up to their potential, and that's what psychologists should include in their understanding of human behavior, that's kind of amazing. I should also point out that Abraham Maslow took a general psychology course when he was in college, and he hated it. It was just absolutely horrible in his view. He thought that the psychology of that time was Sigmund Freud, which was so much based on sexuality, and the behaviorist perspective, which he viewed as too mechanistic, SRS. He thought that psychology was leaving out too much of what really made it important to be a human being, that the most important attributes of human beings were not even being studied by psychologists. He earned a C minus in his general psych course. I'm not violating FERPA laws because that has been published in his biography. But, he really disliked the field, and as an adult, he was able to change it. Another interesting aspect of Maslow's life when you read his biography, growing up in Brooklyn, there were lots of little neighborhoods with gangs, different gangs. And he had trouble getting to school in the morning because he would have to cross through neighborhoods. So there was a point in his childhood where he actually joined a gang in order to protect himself. But he didn't like it at all. He didn't like the kinds of things that children in those gangs did, throwing rocks at cats or, taunting people. And so he dropped out of the gang, and he just solved his problem by getting up extra early and going to the library in the morning. And then he would just read while he was at the library. And when it came time to go to school, his path to school was safer from the library. So, very interesting individual, and someone whose childhood was very difficult, very rough, and yet he grew up to be a humanistic psychologist. The second of the two humanistic psychologists that I want you to know, Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was a psychotherapist, and he too believed that people could be self-actualizing unless something went wrong in their lives. And he based his theoretical perspective on his observations of clients in therapy. Notice I use the word clients. Carl Rogers was a therapist and a psychologist who believed that the term patients was derogatory. And so he referred to his individuals to whom he provided therapy as clients. He thought it was more respectful. He also did not use the classic Freudian therapeutic procedure. He did not use a couch. He did not scribble down everything that the client said. Instead, he wanted the client to be seated in a chair facing him with both chairs the same size. Certainly one could not be bigger than the other. The therapist was not an authority figure in Carl Rogers' therapy approach. And what Carl Rogers noticed in therapy was that quite often his clients would say things like, "I don't know why I did it. It wasn't like me. I can't believe I did that. I'm not that kind of person. And he concluded from this that too many people are raised under conditions of conditional positive regard, conditional positive regard, where love and approval is withheld unless they behave in certain ways, and that causes them to deny aspects of their own personalities. So he thought the purpose of therapy was to provide unconditional positive regard, a safe place where clients can come and speak and feel completely comfortable without any kind of judgment on them. And that if they're allowed that, they would then be self-actualizing, since we're all motivated, unless we're held back, to be the best that we can be. So, Rogerian therapy, therapy conducted by Carl Rogers and his followers, tends to be non-directive and client-centered. The therapist is not considered to be a guide or an expert. The job for the therapist in Rogerian therapy is to listen, to be in the moment with the client, to let the client know that the therapist understands what the client is saying and what the client is feeling, and not to provide advice, just to provide that safe place, non-judgmental place, where the client can work through her or his own problems. And in fact, there are audio tapes of Carl Rogers conducting therapy that you can access online. And studies have been conducted that show that the therapist in Rogerian therapy talks less than therapists in other approaches to therapy. In fact, Carl Rogers has been referred to as the great listener. Now, what I find really interesting about Carl Rogers was that he took this approach to the classroom when he was teaching. And so he would walk into class on the first day and he would just stand there. He wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't assign a syllabus. He wouldn't assign textbooks. He saw himself as a resource for students, and that if you give students a safe, comfortable, non-judgmental environment, then they will design their own paths to education that will allow them to be the best that they can be. If you truly trust that people can be self-actualizing, provided that supportive, non-judgmental environment, then of course you would teach this way. And some students were uncomfortable with it, others loved it. When I asked classes to raise their hands about whether or not they would like to take a course, such as Rogers would teach, the majority of students appeared not to want to do so. I gathered that students tend to like to have a syllabus, they like to know how they're going to be graded, they like to have assignments given to them, and they know exactly what they need to do to have the great outcome that they desire. On the other hand, I do hope that everybody gets to take a course someday that is at least a little bit Rogerian, where they have the freedom to design their own educational goals and ways to achieve those goals.